Hello, and welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. Sorry for the late start. Bit of an unusual day, an unusual week. It's a holiday week, which is wonderful. My children are off school. That's great, but I'm here with you guys. So sorry for being here late. Unfortunately, Marie will not be joining us this week. She's been with us the last few weeks. She's not feeling well, so hopefully she feels better soon. Wishing you well, Marie. But today we'll be back to just me. So, haha, you're stuck with me. I don't know. I'm transitioning into this kind of abruptly. And I'm trying to figure out how to have a good setup here. Anyway, this is the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very, very many reasons. Even though I'm in a nice comfy chair today, I'm leaning back and rocking it. It looks even more like old school Freudian psychodynamic. Look at my fancy chair. No, this is just an open conversation. We're just here to talk about whatever we talk about. Every week we pick a topic. We have one today, although I'm not even sure what it is. I will be looking it up and finding out, as I just heard from Maria an hour or so ago that she's not going to be here. So I'm going to be figuring this out as we go along. I think it's something to do with relationships, and we have some questions. But those of you who are here, if you're in the chat, if you're typing, writing, I see what you're writing. That's going to take us wherever you want to go. It doesn't have to be on the topic of whatever it is that we started discussing. I run a small practice called Effective Artistry. That's our logo up there in the corner. We do therapy, individual, group, couples, family therapy. We also have executive functioning coaches, and Marie is one of them. And you know what? I'll just say as a quick shout out, Sarah Geis, one of our wonderful, wonderful executive functioning coaches, got married over the weekend. Congratulations, Sarah. I was at the wedding. Beautiful ceremony. Just very moving. Incredible toasts. Every single toast was just awesome. And some good dancing, good times. So congratulations, Sarah and Joe. Anything else? Oh, I apologize for those of you who normally watch us on Facebook, which I don't know, you're not here, right? Every once in a while, StreamYard disconnects from our Facebook and we have to reconnect it. And I didn't have time to figure that out as I was transitioning into this late. So we'll get that reset up for next week. For this week, it's only YouTube and Twitch. So I'm sorry to those of you who aren't even able to hear me apologize right now if you're waiting on Facebook. I think that's mostly it. So I'm gonna pull up our questions. What is our topic today? Healthy versus unhealthy relationships and how to navigate through conversations with loved ones, friends, and romantic relationships. How to mend broken or unhealthy relationships. I need to copy and paste this stuff so that I can see it while we are on the stream. Sorry, bear with me here for a minute. Okay. Healthy versus unhealthy relationships. How to navigate conversations. This is a good one. I like this. We start with this. Healthy and unhealthy, toxic. These terms, they're good. They're useful terms. They are terms that are projecting into the future, right? We could just say enjoyable or unpleasant or whatever relationships, right? Hold on, I'm looking off to the side now with the way I rearranged that. There we go. That's good. Okay. And my lighting is terrible. Man, this is just a hot mess. It's Blair Witch Project style stuff. There we go. Okay. This was even worse. What I would start with before we get into the specific questions is wanting to bring focus to the present moment. If we're talking about healthy versus unhealthy, whether it's relationships or habits or whatever, we're talking about outcomes down the line. If you theoretically are doing something that's healthy, you have a better chance that your outcomes further on down the line will be good ones. If you're doing something that's unhealthy, there's a better chance that your outcomes down the line will be bad ones. So a little bit that way of framing, I think, can be troublesome in terms of relationships because it encourages a focus on payoff or outcome. And I don't think that's the best way, the most useful way to look at relationships. I think it's more useful to look at relationships as a series of interactions, some of which are actually happening, right? Like you and I are actually sitting down and talking with each other or playing a game or whatever it is that we do with each other, but many of which take place in my head with my mental model of you. But it's a series of experiences that we're connecting together because it's all with a person or a group of people, whatever that relationship is, but they're still separate experiences because we can't necessarily neatly divide things up, right? Like there are relationships that have really crappy things about them and really wonderful things about them. And this is part of the discourse when it comes to talking about unhealthy or toxic relationships is identifying basically when is it that the bad elements of it are not worth the good elements of it. And that's it's an arbitrary thing, right? You can't always say it's exactly this or exactly that. There's a reason that many, many, many people have found utility over the past, especially I'd say decade or two, in whether in current or in past relationships, examining them and labeling things as toxic, abusive. There's a reason the term gaslighting is all over the place now, because that could be really useful. And on the flip side, people who are being identified by those as abusive or toxic or whatever are then saying, well, how can everything be abusive? What am I? Blah, blah, blah. This is not to defend either side. Definitely, there are things that I would consider toxic. Definitely, there are things that I would consider abusive. And my specifics might be different than your specifics. What matters is yours. Yours meaning whoever it is that's the person in the relationship. If it's useful for you to call it toxic or unhealthy or abusive, great, then it is. If the other person doesn't like that, well, they're probably not going to like that. And if someone's calling you that and you don't define it that way, it's not useful for you to say, no, I'm abusive. Of course, we want to encourage self-reflection, but we're people and terms can be leveraged in ways that are useful for one person but harmful for another. So we're talking to you, the individual, the person in the experience. It doesn't matter whether your conclusions are defensible or reasonable. Reasonable just means that you can explain it in such a way that most people would agree with your conclusion. Doesn't matter. What matters is what's useful to you. Relationships are messy. They're chaotic and ugly and beautiful and whatever. That doesn't mean you excuse every terrible thing in it, but it also means you don't expect only perfection from it. Yeah, okay, enough of a overall whatever. What's our first question? What is the best way to navigate conflict with a partner, friend, loved one without escalation? Well, best way, I mean, too many variables to say best way, but let's talk about some things that can be helpful in terms of avoiding escalation. Number one, I'll say this. I find it useful to talk about escalation between people as a series of steps. You're building on each other. Somebody escalates it, then the other person, we're going to use A and B a lot today since we're talking about relationships. A escalates, B takes it a step higher than A, then A takes it a step higher than B, and so on and so forth. You're building on top of each other. It is very difficult, not impossible, but very difficult for A to escalate. And then if B does not match that or surpass that escalation, they escalate even further and even further and even further. It's very difficult for that to happen. Typically, if that's happening, you're going to see that either whatever B is doing that's not escalating is perceived as escalation. You'll get that a lot, right? Like you're making me out to be like I'm the crazy one. Like, oh, you're so calm and rational, blah, blah, blah. And people do that. I have done that. Not necessarily intentionally. I'm sure I've done it intentionally many times, but there are also times that we do it unintentionally, that we think we're being calm and rational. I'm focusing on this because I think this is a very common thing for neurodivergent people. We think, why are you getting so emotional about this? Why can't we just discuss this calmly and rationally, without really understanding sometimes that saying that, why are you getting so emotional, is an attack, an insult, whether we intend it to be or not. And sometimes we do. Sometimes we do, at least speaking for myself, sometimes we do want it to be like, why? Stop. You're being crazy. Just talk to me like I'm talking to you, which is just a very subtle and crazy making attack, because how do you respond to that? But If one person doesn't escalate, it is much more difficult for the other person to keep escalating. They do feel progressively, not always, but tend to feel progressively more out of line, out of character, whatever it is. Having said all that, I'll say escalation is not necessarily a bad thing. What am I trying to say? I don't want to give the impression that allowing emotion into a conversation is somehow a failure, that rationality is good and emotionality is bad. That is absolutely, absolutely not the case. Emotion is important, it's valid, it belongs in a conversation, especially a conversation that's a conflict. That how we feel about things is important. It doesn't have to just be, in fact, again, something I see a lot is people over relying on intellectual justification. That like, it's okay for me to not want to do this thing with you because X, Y, and Z, when it's just okay for me to not want to do something sometimes. A lot of times arguments do end up just kind of being each person is trying to justify their point in a way that doesn't rely on any understanding of their emotional experience. We don't, what am I trying to say? We do too much, generally speaking, self-analysis or psychological analysis. I think that people spend too much on you're doing X because your mother, blah, 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 and I'm doing Y because I have a fear of yada, yada. We don't need all that etiology. We can just be present with ourselves in the moment and say, I don't like this. The thing that you just did made me feel bad. I don't have to tell you why you're doing it or make it some larger pattern. Part of that escalation, a lot of times that escalation starts before the conversation, right? I'm imagining having the conversation with you later and I'm playing out your part with my mental model of you. I'll say this, well, then you might say that. Well, then I could say this, and then you might say that. And those ones go bad. When you're doing it in your head, it's very rare that you spend much time. So, I mean, not rare that we have a conversation in our head of like, oh, I need to tell this person that, done, end of story. But if we're spending time on it, if we're worried about it, then it's because I'll say this, and then they could say this, they could say that, or they could say this terrible thing, in which case I have to say this terrible thing. I have said just absolutely terrible, like devastating, soul destroying things to people in my head that I would never, ever, ever, ever say out loud, because the only purpose of those things is to just crush somebody's soul, which I would never want to do. But when I'm in my head having a conversation, I'm playing out the worst possible things they could say to me. So one way to avoid escalation is to talk frequently, to communicate about this stuff early, even when that means scheduling things. And often it does, especially these days. People are busy, especially with work from home. Like, boundaries are flexible if they exist at all. It's hard. And the stuff that's important needs to be scheduled out, even though it doesn't sometimes feel like that's spontaneous or meaningful. It's like, okay, we're having our 15-minute check-in or whatever. So what? It's better than not having it. Schedule these conversations out. Talk to each other as early as possible, the moment that you're having a problem. Part of what will happen is, oh, I don't like what they did, but it's not a super big deal, so I'm not going to say anything or make a big deal out of it. Well, I'm using these hand motions. So okay, this is baseline. I don't like what they did, but it's not a big deal. It's not worth having a whole conversation about. First of all, that implies that having a conversation is somehow problematic, which you might have evidence for. Maybe every time I do say something, it turns into a fight. I can't just say, hey, I didn't like that thing you did without it becoming a huge whatever, which is a sign that that relationship probably could benefit from some communication work. It devalues your experience, right? That, even though I don't like it, who cares? I can suffer through it. And it doesn't resolve whatever happened. I didn't like that thing that happened. Well, the other person doesn't know unless you tell them. So that experience doesn't go away. You're just dealing with it. If it happens again, it's still not going away. If it happens again or it gets worse, and then by the time you pass whatever arbitrary bar you've set before it's worth saying something, now it's up here instead of down here. A really silly, but actually very common example of this is not an emotional thing. And certainly it can result in emotional, but the original conflict is just if one person is saying something, A is saying something and B can't quite hear. If B interrupts right away, I'm sorry, I can't quite hear what you're saying. Easy to resolve. If B's like, yeah, I don't want to bother them. Well, the longer A talks that B can't hear, the bigger a deal. It's like, uh-oh. And then at some point I got to say, I'm sorry, I didn't hear anything you just said. And then why did you just let me talk for 2 minutes if you couldn't hear what I was saying, right? The sign of a optimally healthy relationship to me is I can talk to you with minimal impulse, right? That it doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to be something that I justify as being worth our conversation. I can say to you any random thing that pops into my head. Doesn't mean I will say every random thing that pops in my head, because that would be way too many things. But just when something pops in my head, if it seems like it's worth saying, oh man, see how hard it is. I just already said it has to be worth saying. If we're in connection, if we're in community, if we're around each other, any thought that pops into my head, I can share with you without much problem. If we're not, any thought that pops into my head that might be relevant to you, I have to hang on to if I'm going to say it to you, which takes up working memory space. So that's where we start getting into, is it worth it? And this isn't just a conscious decision, it's cognitive miser, right? We don't spend resources without a reason. Working memory space is a resource. So I can't remember every thought I have, but if I hit on the thought of, I should tell Susan that, Susan's my wife, I should tell Susan that later. Okay, I got to hold on to it. So that's taking up some of my resources. And every additional thing I think of that I need to tell Susan later takes up more and more and more, and I get more stressed, more irritable, less able to focus, more brain foggy, whatever you want to call it. So the longer the times go between our check-ins, the more I'm going to have, and the more likely it is that stuff is going to skew negative. Because if I am talking to you, any thought I have, not all my thoughts are negative, I can say anything. But if I have to save up over the course of a day what's worth saying, then I'm going to only save the very best and the very worst. And if I have to wait for a week, this is why the silent treatment, quote unquote, I don't know why I'm saying quote unquote, that's the thing. This is why the silent treatment causes this problem. It's a day, 2 days, 3 days, weeks, months, however long it's happening, of just thinking things that you want to say to the other person but can't. And the longer time goes on, the worse those things get. All the good stuff disappears because it's not as important as the bad stuff you need to remember to say later. So that's one. Talk frequently. Another is, here's a specific exercise I use with people. This is very intensive and formal and feels a little silly and awkward and forced or performative or whatever when you have to do it. It's not worth doing all the time, but it is worth doing sometimes. A says something. B, before responding, says back to A verbatim what A said to the best of their ability. You're not going to do it all. You can't. In fact, part of the point, I'll finish off the exercise and then explain why we're doing everything. So A says something, B says back to the best of their ability, verbatim, word for word, what A just said. And then says, did I get everything? And then A clarifies only if there was something that A stated in the initial statement that wasn't repeated back, but that is important to A that it comes across. You can repeat that. Do not expand, do not add, don't go on to the next point. Just either, yes, you got it. That's not word for word everything I said, but you got the important stuff. Or, yes, you got some of it. Here's a part that you didn't say back that's important to me, and I'm restating it. And then B, if that's the second case, B states it back again until A eventually, sooner or later, says, yep, you heard all the important stuff. Then B responds. And then A says back verbatim what B said to the best of their ability. And you just repeat this pattern over and over and over and over. It is time and energy intensive. It is weird and formal and awkward, but it will help you stop from escalating. When there are issues in a relationship, we can broadly break that down into two categories. I mean, of course, we could break things down in any kind of a way, but this is a useful way. Communication issues versus actual meaningful disagreements. Meaning, if if I want our family to spend Christmas with my family and you want our family to spend Christmas with your family, that's a meaningful disagreement. We can't both get what we want there. We have to find some way to navigate this. We got to come up with a compromise, or one of us is going to get what we want and the other one won't, or whatever. Communication issues is when there's not necessarily a meaningful difference. In other words, we both want to have a fun weekend together. Cool. And we might both arrive at the same conclusions on how to get there. But if we start getting into, well, why aren't you suggesting anything? Well, why aren't you suggesting anything? That's most likely a communication issue. In all relationships have conflict. That's inevitable. I don't know what a relationship without any conflict would even look like, or whether it would be worth having, or whatever. But all relationships have conflict. The better the relationship, the better you can navigate the conflict. Not necessarily the less conflict you have. I definitely prefer a less frequent conflict style. But actually, if anyone has not heard of John and Julia, I can't remember, Gottman, they're in the Gottman Institute. Some of the best research on couples dynamics, relationship dynamics that's out there. They have some incredible, useful stuff. Their big claim to fame is that they can listen. They've developed a framework that they can listen to a couple have a conversation for, I want to say it's 5 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and then predict whether that couple will still be together 5 years from that point. And it's like a 97% accuracy. So it's impressive. Why did I start talking about? Oh, because what the Gottman research will say is that frequency of conflict doesn't really correlate to whether or not a relationship works out. Some couples fight a lot. Some couples rarely ever fight. Neither one of those is better or worse than the other, as long as it's working for both people. What matters is how you repair and what the ratio of positive to negative interactions is. You can fight every day. You can fight once a year, but their golden ratio is 5 to 1. For every negative interaction, you want to have 5 positive interactions. And there's a lot of science behind this. We've talked about it a lot. A lot of it has to do with cognitive miser and our preference, our attentional process is preference for negative over positive. It takes a lot more to notice and remember positive stuff than negative stuff. So if you're going to come away from a day, an interaction, a relationship with any sense that it's a good one, that actually means you have to have about 5 times as much positive interactions versus negative interactions. So it's not that you need to never fight. It's about how you do it, how you repair, and how much good stuff are you getting in between. That's why we're saying not constant, but the more frequent the communication, the more likely it is that you're going to be talking about and having positive experiences for a good chunk of those, proportion of those. Why was I starting with the 5? I was talking about, it's so much harder to do this by myself than when I have somebody else with me. Frequency of conflict. I don't remember why I started down that path. Talking about escalation. So that repeating back to each other thing. It is intensive. It's not worth doing all the time. That is one of those things where you want to make sure that it's worth doing. And the higher the conflict, the more it is worth doing. Another thing to know is there's something called prefrontal cortex shutdown. We've talked about this a lot, and there's lots of different words that more or less mean the same thing. We're talking about an experience, an individual's experience of, we can call it fight or flight, we can call it meltdown, call it prefrontal cortex shutdown. I'm not saying that all these terms are exactly the same thing, but they evoke a very similar experience. What this means is the brain has, the brain and the body, just being a human, you have backups on backups on backups, like redundancies on redundancies, emergency release valves. We are very, very resilient creatures. We can survive a lot. So there's optimal ways to do things, but when the optimal isn't working, we have something to fall back on. And when that doesn't work, we have something else to fall back on, something else to fall back on. I think it's useful to think of emotion like this, that it's a safety protocol, right? That sure, it's nice to be calm and for us to discuss things and we can talk about what might happen in the future and like all kinds of things that aren't really physically present in the moment and yada yada. That can be great. And sometimes it's not. Sometimes that's a terrible way to talk about something. Sometimes it doesn't help at all. And emotion is one of those things that it builds. You get some emotion, you can hide it, you can suppress it, you can mask it. But as the intensity of that emotional experience increases, at a certain point, the option to suppress it, disguise it, is removed from you. Sooner or later, you're going to cry or scream or laugh or whatever it is. I kind of think of that as our, you know, emergency pressure release valve, right? Like we're trying to keep it tightened up, but sooner or later we're going to express it in a way that other people are going to be able to observe. So even if we, a very common example for neurodivergent people, even if we feel like we're a burden to people and that we don't deserve help and that we're making a big deal out of nothing and that we should be able to do X, Y, or Z without a problem and whatever. So we try not to make it anybody else's issue. You can try and you can try, but sooner or later it's going to come out. Which is not to say that it's like, oh, if you hold on to anger, you'll explode, although that is a thing that happens. It's not an inevitable thing. You don't have to express every piece of emotion. It's just if there's a problem, if something's happening that makes you feel emotional and you don't resolve it, change it, remove yourself from it, whatever, if you don't resolve it in some way, then it's going to happen more or continue to happen or happen again or whatever. And therefore the emotion will increase and increase and increase until something happens about it. Think of it kind of like pain, physical pain. If I prick my finger and it hurts a little bit, I can ignore it. I can get a shot and be like, okay, it hurts. I don't like it, but I know what it is. It's a second. It doesn't take much. But if that pain, if that sensation of pain increases and or just continues, persists without relief, sooner or later, I'm not going to be able to just sit here and not flinch or not make a noise. It's going to escalate and I'm going to have to do something about it. Emotion is like that. It's a signal. It means something. And we are imperfect creatures. And so we're sometimes angry about things that aren't worth being angry about. We sometimes feel pain about things like shots that are actually good for us, even though the feeling in that moment, the pain, is a signal of, hey, watch out, something bad's happening. It's not actually bad. So that's why we have cognition, consciousness, that we can override those things. But if you try to override it too much for too long, sooner or later you run out of the ability to override it and it's going to come out. It's one of the things I'm saying about it's not bad to be emotional. If you feel an emotion, it's good to express that. And yes, I would prefer if someone's angry at me, I would prefer that they say, I'm really angry at you, than that they just punch me. But there are practical reasons for that, right? When my 3-year-old cries, I'm not saying take a breath. When my 3-year-old cries, I will sometimes say, let's take a breath. I'll do the things that I have learned to do to help regulate him, get him back online so that he can express to me what it is that's bothering him. Not because there's anything wrong with the crying, but because when he's crying, I don't necessarily know what he's crying about. It's a very clear signal that something is wrong and he wants or needs help, and I'm there. But it's not always a clear signal of what exactly help he needs, and so I can't necessarily do anything with it. So the encouragement to get back online and to be able to take a breath and calm his body and calm his voice and say to me it's not because that's better. It's because without that, I don't have the information. Sometimes if he falls and hits his head and he's crying, I don't need him to calm down and explain to me what happened. If I saw what happened, I know what I need to do, right? It is not inherently better to be unemotional. It is inherently more difficult to communicate with precision and specificity and clarity as you get more emotional. So when that matters, and it often does, especially in relationship conflict, then yes, we do want to try and stay even keeled so that we can clarify. And that's why we want to keep the focus on the communication. If you find yourself starting to get into like, you always this and you never that, or I always this, there's a million different relationship books out there or piece of advice or whatever out there that point out all these red flags of when a conversation isn't going well. All these are various versions of prefrontal cortex shutdown. The thinking hasn't been working. The communicating with whatever precision and clarity you've been trying to communicate with hasn't been working. And so the brain is going into fight or flight, dumps adrenaline into the bloodstream. It's not about thinking anymore. Now it's about doing. But when it comes to relationship conflict, that's more often than not unhelpful. It's great when we're trying to run away from a predator or whatever, but when we're trying to navigate something that needs to be communicated about, well, part of what happens in that prefrontal cortex shutdown, the part of the brain that is responsible for higher level thinking, for genuinely hearing and understanding what another person is saying to you, stops working. And so you get into a place where I'm not hearing what you're saying. I'm just trying to think of how to make my point so that you'll hear me. And you're not hearing what I'm saying. So you're just trying to think about how you make your point so that I'll hear you. And it just escalates and it gets worse and worse and worse. If you find yourself unable to hear what the other person is saying, once you're noticing prefrontal cortex shutdown, the only thing that can be done is getting back online. Once your prefrontal cortex is back online, then you can revisit the conflict. I'm not saying let it go and never come back to it. I'm saying in that moment, there's nothing that you can do about it. And we've all had this experience being in fights that last until 3 a.m. And then 2 days later, we're like, what in the world were we fighting about like that? Your brain just stops working in the way that it needs to work in order to communicate. It shifts into working in the way that it needs to work to get you through a dangerous situation. And sometimes relationships are dangerous, obviously. But if we're treating our communication like it's dangerous, the only thing that we can do is fight or flight. We can fight with the person or run away from them. I'm not always literally, right? Oh, forgot to silence my phone. So you want to be able to, and we've talked about this in other, you want to be able to notice when you're starting to get into that state as early as possible. You want to have a big list of things that you can do for yourself, that someone else can do for you, that you can do for your partner or whomever it is that you're in a relationship with, whether it's a sibling or a friend or whatever, so that you can notice for each other and for yourselves when you're starting to go into that prefrontal cortex shutdown and get yourselves back online. For some people, sometimes that's not something that's going to happen in the communication. We need to pause and separate and come back to it later. For some people, sometimes pausing and separating makes it worse. And that's one of those meaningful differences where it's like, how do we navigate it? Real quick and easy and simple. If that's happening in your relationship, then pause because one person needs to, and make it clear when you're pausing when the conversation will be revisited for the person who has a hard time being out of the conversation. In other words, I'm overwhelmed, whatever words you use. I'm overwhelmed. I need a break. I need to stop this. Okay, when are we going to come back to it? Can we talk about this in 2 hours? Can we talk about this tomorrow night? Can we talk about this weekend? You agree on when it's going to come back before you split up. Is the best way I know to compromise for those people. I want to talk about it until it's resolved person. Oh, another really great thing you can do to help avoid conflict escalation is to validate while not necessarily agreeing. And it's important that that can be for the other person, but it also can be for yourself in the past. Meaning, if someone's coming to me and they're saying, I'm the worst and everybody hates me, I don't want to say, no, you're not, everybody loves you. That's dismissive. It's invalidating, right? I want to validate their experience. But I also don't want to say, you're right, you are the worst and everybody hates you, because that's terrible and it's untrue. So we need to be able to validate without agreeing. And what that means, validating someone is not agreeing with them. Validating somebody is to say that the way that they're thinking, the way that they're feeling, the experience that they're having is understandable, reasonable. It's not crazy. It's not irrational. It's not whatever. It is understandable. Meaning if someone's saying, I'm the worst and everybody hates me, well, I can understand that you would think that. I don't agree. I don't think you're the worst and I don't think everybody hates you, but I can understand why you would think that. Or if I can't understand why someone would think that, then I need to ask questions until I can understand it. Why would you say that? What makes you think that you're the worst? What makes you think that everybody hates you? I texted a friend to see if they wanted to hang out, and they said no, and then I saw pictures of them with other friends of ours, and they're out having fun together, and nobody invited me. Okay, yeah, I can see it. Like, if that happened to me, I also might think that they all hate me. I get that. I still don't think everybody hates you. I still don't think you're the worst. So validate, understand, know that all reactions, emotional, whatever, all reactions are, I was going to say reasonable, but not reasonable, because reasonable means that people have to agree with it, are reactions. All emotion, all thought, all behavior is a response to something. There are reasons for things, even if they're not good reasons. There are reasons for things, even if the response takes a big leap from what it was that initially happened. But even then, there's reasons, even if they're internal. It's really difficult, but really helpful to be able to do this with your past self when you're in a relationship. Meaning that you want to be able to say things like, I have to tell you, I felt like you don't care about me at all. I know that's not true now. I'm calm. I'm back online. You know, we're through it a bit, whatever. Like, obviously, I know I don't agree with that thought. I don't think it's a true thought, but I do think it's important to communicate to you that that was my experience, that whatever happened, that my response to what happened was to feel as though you don't care about me at all. And I don't like feeling that way. I don't want to feel that way again. So I want to treat what happened as important, as worth talking about, because it made me feel that, even though I don't feel that anymore. Because a lot of the problem comes from defensiveness, where we experience something and then we can't go back and disagree with it later on. Instead of saying, I felt like you don't care about me at all in that moment, we say, it's like you don't even care about me. And now we're having a conversation about whether or not you care about me, instead of whatever it was that happened that led to me feeling that way. So it can be valid. It's an understandable reaction to what happened, even if it's untrue or inaccurate. Because if we go the other way and just say, oh, well, because I don't think it's true that you don't care about me, and therefore I'm not going to mention it, well, then there's some important information that's going unused. There was an experience, a big one. It mattered. It meant something. And now we're just ignoring it because I don't think that my thought was a true thought. Who cares? I think inaccurate, untrue things all the time. It still hurt. It still sucked. If I'm having a panic attack and think I'm going to die, it doesn't matter that later on I'm like, yeah, I know it was a panic attack and I didn't die. It, in that moment, was terrible. And whatever led to the panic attack should be treated as though it is something that at least has a chance to put me in a position where I feel like I'm going to die, even though I don't think I will. Anyway, there's a lot of different stuff about escalation. There's more questions. Let me just read through them all here. How do I know if a relationship is broken beyond repair? Does that concept even exist? How do I bring up an issue I have with someone who cannot handle any type of confrontation? That's a similar kind of question. How do I know how much conflict is normal, healthy in a healthy relationship? Well, we kind of talked about that. What are the qualities of a healthy relationship? So 3 of those are pretty similar, and we can address a lot of that. So how much conflict is normal, healthy in a healthy relationship? Not an answer to that. But that's not just Brandon talking. That's the Gottman Institute research, right? There's not an answer. The answer is, how do you feel? Same with that second one. How do I know if a relationship is broken beyond repair? Does that concept even exist? Well, yes and no. It's a concept, right? It's a construct, meaning we could say that theoretically any relationship is repairable, because that is theoretically true, but we're not living infinite different lives in infinite different multiverses. You get one. And so if a relationship is broken and you don't repair it, then it was broken beyond repair. Otherwise, we're treating it as what an incredibly high bar to say that you're not allowed to leave a relationship unless there's not even the possibility of repairing it. I don't want to have people be in a situation where that's their bar. Like, could this theoretically be repaired? Yeah, so I should work on that. No. The question isn't, is it able to be repaired? The question is it worth trying to repair? And that comes back to, conflict is normal or whatever, what are the qualities of a healthy relationship? Qualities of a healthy relationship. I'll give you better, like more self-helpy answers, Gottman Institute answers here in a minute. But at the end of the day, it's about the people in the relationship. Relationships require work, even when they're good. And I don't just mean even good relationships have conflict. That's not the only work. There's a lot of work in a relationship that isn't about conflict. Maintaining an idea, a mental model of the other person in and of itself is labor intensive. But remembering what things you like and enjoy, doing those things, finding those things. My wife's birthday is coming up, thinking about what to get her for her birthday. That's work. Every day, waking up, which one of us is going to get up with the kids, thinking about the other person and how tired they are, or, who did it last. Not that we always take turns that way, but you think about these things. Being in a relationship means you're thinking about other people. And if you weren't in that relationship with them, you wouldn't be thinking about them to that extent. So good or bad, it's work. The question is the value worth the cost? And yes, relationships, even good ones, even ones that you can consider healthy or look back on later and say, yes, I'm glad that we stayed in this relationship. Even relationships like that can go through periods where it is not worth it in that period. That for this week, this month, whatever, this is a net negative, right? That this relationship is taking more from me than it's giving to me. It's not sustainable. We can repair it later and get it back to another place. That happens. But just like with anything, if what you're doing is unpleasant, painful, unsustainable, and you're doing it because you have a hope of a payoff at a later date, sometimes it does pay off, sometimes it doesn't. And I don't have a good way, nobody does, to say which time is which. Just know that if you're in that place where it's taking more from you than it's giving to you, it's a net negative, it is unsustainable, just know that either something has to change. No, I shouldn't say that. Know that something will change. Either you can try and take some control of that and influence what the change is, how it happens and when, or you can push it off and just hope and just wait and ignore and blah, blah, blah. And then change will happen outside of your control. You'll lose the ability to control your response, or they will do something that you're not in control of, or whatever. So if you're in that state, call it a rough patch or whatever. No, this is, the longer we wait to address this, the longer it takes to fix this, the greater the chance that this is going to blow up. And no, it doesn't matter. Theoretically, every relationship is repairable, sure. Because theoretically, any person can change anything, theoretically. But will it happen? Is it worth it? That's a better question. As a simple, more of an exercise thing, how do I know if a relationship is broken beyond repair? What we're really saying is, how do I know if I want to leave a relationship, end a relationship? There are different ways of doing that depending on the relationship. One is just calibrate how much time and energy and whatever you're spending with the other person so that it matches what you're getting out of it, right? That if you're my best friend, we hang out every single day, great. And then if something changes and we don't get along quite as well, I don't have to say, no, it's every single day or nothing. We can just step back and we don't see each other as much. We see each other as much as we want to see each other. Even that can lead to the relationships tapering off, right? Like, you didn't break up with all your high school friends. You just talked to some of them, and some of them you didn't, and some you did for a little bit, and it was less and less. And now before you know it, it's been 10 years and whatever. It doesn't have to be an official declaration all the time. Sometimes it does. Obviously, in romantic relationships, especially cohabitating. I don't know what the proper word is there, actually. People living together. We have to have some discussion here. I can't just kind of fade out of your life or you fade out of mine. We have logistical things that need to be arranged. So sometimes it has to be a conversation. But yeah, I don't know. Same with that second one. How do I bring up an issue who cannot handle any type of confrontation? That's not a thing. It's not possible for a person to be unable to handle any type of confrontation unless you're defining confrontation in some very specific way. What you mean is, when I have tried to bring stuff up with them, it hasn't gone well. Maybe it hasn't gone well any single time, but usually that's not the case. Usually it frequently goes very poorly. And then it's more work. You've pay more attention to some of the things we're talking about. How can this person be brought back online? How can you put things out to them in a way that validates your experience without necessarily stating it as a truth, right? Really, I'm hitting that one again. It's a big one. Things like, what's a good example? You always get your way. We always do it your way is a statement that's probably not literally true. It would be very, very difficult for that to be literally true, but it's evocative. And we certainly have that experience where it's like, I can't think of a single example of when we disagreed and it's gone my way. It always goes your way. If I say that to you that way, it always goes your way, as opposed to, look, we disagreed and we decided to go your way. And that's okay. But I got to tell you that my experience in response to that is I'm thinking about all the times that we've disagreed and it's gone your way. And I can't think of times, I'm sure they exist, but I couldn't think of any times where we disagreed and it went my way. So that's how I'm feeling in this relationship. I'm feeling trapped. I'm feeling bossed. I'm feeling unimportant, as opposed to saying, you always literally get your way. We never do it my way. It's a harder thing to respond to. If you think that the other person cannot handle any type of confrontation, what you mean is they can't handle any of the confrontations that you've tried to have. And even then, what do you mean cannot handle? Maybe what you're saying is, oh, they can't handle confrontation. Maybe that's their type of confrontation. And the fact that you're viewing, I'm trying to talk rationally, and they get so emotional and hurtful. Well, that's their way of dealing with that confrontation. If I don't like it when they're getting emotional and hurtful, and then I get emotional and hurtful in response, couldn't we phrase that as you not handling the confrontation either? And we're not even going to get into, because we don't have time. I tried to point this out a little bit. This gets into abuse and abusive relationships. The point is not to say, take responsibility for your role in the abuse or, blah, 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 nothing like that. It's not the point. People are assholes. People are abusive. It happens. But we're talking about the reality of what's going on, which is to say, you treat people in response to what they do, not what they think and feel. Meaning, I don't know what you think. I don't know what you feel. Even if you tell me what you're thinking, I know what you say. And hopefully, if we're communicating well, the things that you're saying evoke thoughts and concepts and experiences in me that are relatively similar to the ones that you're trying to convey. But it's not going to be the exact same. I don't know your thoughts. I don't know your feelings. I can say that all that stuff is valid and still say, but what you're doing is abusive. I don't have to be able to label you as evil in order to justify walking away from you or protecting myself or fighting back or whatever other thing. I'm not talking about you as a person, your internal subjective lived experience. I don't know that. I know what you're doing and I know the impact you're having on me. That's what I'm responding to. And if that impact is abusive, I don't give a shit if your mom wasn't nice to you or whatever trauma you went through that led to this process of you being abusive to me. I still have to deal with the abuse. And I can separate that. Of course, not always, right? But especially earlier on, I can separate needing to deal with what you're doing and protect myself or whatever, separate from having to think of you as a terrible, evil monster. Good people do bad things, whatever. I don't care. I don't care. Good people, bad people. It's just a construct. What the hell does that mean? I'm dealing with what's happening. If you're doing, I almost swore. If you're doing bad stuff, I don't care whether that means you're a bad person or not. We can have that philosophical debate some other time. You're doing bad stuff, I don't care. It needs to be dealt with. Now, how I deal with that might be influenced by why I think you're doing the bad stuff. And then I'm getting into thoughts and feelings and whether you're a bad person. But again, that's just projection, right? Like, meaning, not projection, not the defense mechanism projection into the future, prediction. That I'm trying to say, well, you've done this once. I don't know if you'll do it again. When I've done it twice, it seems more likely you're going to do it. You've done it 3 times. If you've done it 500 times, somewhere in there, I'm going to reach a point where I'm like, I'm pretty confident in predicting you're going to continue to do this. Maybe theoretically you might not if I treated you differently, but I don't really give a crap. Or maybe theoretically you might not if you had a different childhood, or if you didn't have the crappy job you have, or whatever. But we're not talking about theoretical. We're talking about what's happening. And the more it happens, the more confident I am that it will continue to happen. And at a certain point, I hit a limit and say, yep, not worth it anymore. please don't try and justify it. If you have to be able to justify leaving someone, fighting with someone, whatever, by saying that they're an evil person, that's such a high bar. You don't need to put up with enough stuff until you can justify it that extent. Just respond to what's happening. What are the qualities of a healthy relationship? Good, honest, clear, authentic, frequent communication. That's pretty much it. Do you have to have things in common? Nope. Does it make it easier to communicate more frequently if you have interests in common? Yeah. If we both like the same stuff, that's an easy way to make it, that's going to make it so that we communicate more frequently. Is it necessary? No. And hobbies are one thing to have in common. Values are a thing to have in common. Shared lives are things to have in common. My wife and I don't have really any hobbies in common. We like some of the same media. We like some, like our TV show tastes overlap quite a bit. Our movie tastes overlap a good amount. Not completely, and that's okay. You shouldn't be looking for a relationship that contains everything in it for you. A, that's impossible. B, that would not be sustainable if one person is supposed to be everything for you. So having things in common is helpful, but only because it makes it easier to communicate. The communication is what matters in terms of whether it's sustainable. Now, I can communicate with someone really great and still not enjoy their presence, right? Like we can communicate well and authentically and frequently and whatever, and I still don't like feel romantic attraction to them or platonic attraction to them, or I don't enjoy being around them, whatever. It's not the only quality that matters, but the other stuff is also subjective. I will say one thing from the Gottman research, aside from that 5-to-1 ratio, two other things that are worth looking up, and you can Google this stuff. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse is what Gottman calls it. And I can't remember. Stonewalling, condescension. No, I can't remember off the top of my head. But there are 4 ways, 4 types of things that a person can do to another person that if that's happening, that's a good sign that this is going in a bad direction. Once you see one or more of those 4 things, that's why they're called 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Doesn't mean it can't be changed. But it means if you see one or more of those 4 things, you got to work on changing that stuff or it's going downhill from now on. And bids for attention, meaning a big part of what a relationship is, romantic or otherwise, is just feeling as though the other person observes you, feeling seen, heard, cared about, right? So a bid for attention in the Gottman stuff is if I'm saying, oh, look at that bird out there, I'm bidding for your attention. You have to respond to those bids for attention. If I say, wow, look at that bird out there, you don't have to drop whatever you're doing and come look at the bird. But you can say, sorry, I'm busy. Or you can say, oh, yeah, what is it? Or you can drop what you're doing and come over and look at it or whatever. But just let me know that you heard me. Give me some response. If I say, wow, look at that bird over there, and you say nothing, do nothing, respond in no way, then what do? Either I have to escalate it. Hey, look at this bird out here. Maybe you didn't hear me. I'm being louder. Because maybe you didn't hear me. If you didn't, and I say it again, you respond. That's not failing to hear someone is not failing to respond to a bid for attention. So but if the first one you heard and now the second one you heard too, what? Now do you respond or no? Do I escalate again? Do I just let it go? Oh, I guess you didn't hear me and stop. Try to respond to those bids for attention. If the other person is talking to you, reaching out to you, signaling something to you, if they do a silly little dance to make you smile, acknowledge them, acknowledge each other. Just be present and aware of each other. Talk to each other more than you talk to the mental models that you have built of each other in your heads. Yeah, okay. I'm saying a lot of stuff. I gotta wrap up. This was fun. Hopefully Marie will be back with us next week. And we'll be back on Facebook next week, and maybe we have more specific questions, and we'll see. Thank you all for being here. I will see you in a week. Thanks.